Welcome back to the McCann Dogs podcast, episode 49. And I am joined this week, as I am every week, with our Director of Online Training, Instructor Shannon Viljasu. And thanks for joining us, Shannon.
Thanks for having me. Hi, everybody.
Now, we're going to get a little bit back on track. We're gonna jump right back into. I don't know if you joined us for last week's episode, but we talked about making the difficult decision to euthanize your dog, and that was a really tough one. We wanted to lighten the mood. We wanted to talk a little bit more about training for our podcast audience, and this week's topic is so important for any dog owner, anyone who wants a reliable response from their dog. And this comes from Shannon's blog post, which we'll talk to her about in just a moment. But the topic or the title of this week's episode is your dog easily distracted? Great. And here's why. I'm Ken Steep, and welcome back to McCann Dogs. Now, this is a popular topic, Shannon, and let's talk about the reason for the blog post and why you thought it was so important to open this conversation with students.
I find that increasingly there's this tone in the dog training world that people, as we make our dogs bigger and bigger parts of our lives, sort of like what people do with kids. When there's behavior that we don't necessarily like, we tend to excuse it away rather than working through it. And I started this blog post by saying, there's two main types of people. That obviously is simplification. There's a lot of different types of people out there. But what we see a lot in dog training is the people who will either, acknowledge that they're facing something difficult with their dog, like contending with distractions, and they'll roll up their sleeves and they'll really get to work and make things work for their dog. And then there's the people who will see that there's a problem and look for excuses to blame something else. So whether it's the breed, whether it's the breed tendency, whether it's the environment, whatever it is, they're looking for something else to shift the blame to. And I said in the blog post, of those two people, which one do you think ends up with a well-trained dog after all is said and done? So I wanted to bring that idea to light that, every dog is trainable, and we've had 80,000 dogs come through our door since we opened in 1982. And I can tell you for a fact, I would venture to say that none of those dogs were untrainable. They all have their own unique challenges. There's the occasional dog that will come into your life that is so wonderful and they're not distracted by anything. And, they just go along to get along sort of thing. And they're your little shadow, and that's wonderful. But those dogs are few and far between. And I personally have never had one of those dogs. I've had dogs that were certainly more amiable and more eager to work and do the things that I asked them to do. And I've had dogs that were a little bit more on the independent side that I've had to work a little bit harder with. Those dogs, the ones that have been more independent, that I've had to think outside the box, that I've had to really deal with the distractions and the things that go on that, make it difficult to get your dog's attention. Those are the dogs that have really made me a good dog trainer and made me realize that every dog is trainable, because every single time I had any sort of a challenge with my dog, I'm the type of personality that I look for a solution with that. So I would never simply say, oh, dog's a toller, so he's never going to pay attention to me. No, not at all. I want that dog to pay attention to me. So I need to figure out what exactly trips that dog's trigger to get him motivated and focused on me. So thinking back over the dogs that I've had in my lifetime, I love it when I have a dog that is extremely distracted by something. And I wanted to sort of pull some of the ideas and some of the rewards and the methods that we use around here. I wanted to pull them and put them in an article that would help people who are feeling, frustrated and struggling with distractions. I know one in particular with Nettie I struggled extremely with, and I'm sure we'll touch on that.
I get so frustrated when I hear the excuse makers out there that say, they consume some of our content. They say, well, good luck trying that with a Weimaraner, or good luck getting a Whippet to do that. Or I'd love to see a terrier who would do this behavior. And we have these instructors on staff who all have those dogs. I mean, we have so many amazing instructors with a great variety of different breeds, or we have so many of these different breeds in our program that we can point to exactly that breed of dog doing this behavior. But it's as you mentioned, it's so vitally important to recognize that there is a challenge presented, and you can train through it. I mean, we've seen it happen so many times, and I think when we talk about distractions, which are a part of everyday life with your dog, and are a great way to proof a skill. We talk about using a currency of reward that your dog finds valuable, and maybe counterintuitively, some of those distractions may be used as a reward. And you talk a little bit about that in your article. Let's touch on that for a moment.
Yeah, absolutely. So every dog is an individual. There are breed traits for sure. And that's something that I think is really important to know as you're doing your research before you actually get into a breed. For example, you need to know that a terrier, they're bred to take on vermin head on. They're bred to be tough. They're bred to be tenacious. You need to know that going in so that you can use some of those things as a reward and as a benefit to you. So for example, if I've got a terrier that's really excited about motion, I can find something that uses motion to direct that attention to me and to reinforce the things that I want my dog to do, which aren't necessarily innately rewarding for him. For example, if I have a terrier and I ask him to sit rather than to run after a squirrel, that really isn't going to be a rewarding behavior for him in and of itself. However, if I then use some sort of a really wonderful furry tug toy to reward that terrier for sitting when, there's something that he'd rather do, I can teach him systematically to focus back on me and to expect the rewards to come from me. So rather than being in the environment and trying to access his own rewards, I can control those rewards. And with Ned, I have never in my life had a dog who was so obsessed with water right from day one. And he's actually from Vancouver. And when I went out to pick him up, and I spent the weekend in Vancouver, and when I was at the breeder's house, they had a kiddie pool in the backyard and all the puppies were playing. And Ned went running over to the pool multiple times and just plunked right down in it and wallowed in it. And I thought, oh, he'll fit right in with Reggie because Reggie loves to do the same thing. Well, little did I know how obsessive he was going to be about it. And basically, I found out very quickly that any puddle, any little pool of water anywhere was grounds for him to absolutely lose his little mind and want to be in there. So quite quickly in our relationship, I formulated a plan to make that work for me. And it really did work to my advantage because controlling that distraction basically made Ned realize that wonderful reward was accessible through me and not through himself. So how I set that up was to control the environment. So he was always on leash if there was any chance of there being water around. And, if you've listened to any of our podcasts, you know that we always have our puppies on leash or long line because we want to stay one step ahead of them. And we want to make sure that we can control the environment so that we can control where the reinforcement comes from. So I started out with, we have a creek on the property here. I started out at the back with him on leash. And of course, as soon as he was near the creek, he wanted to just beeline down to it. But basically, I just physically stopped him from being able to get there. And we worked on simple things. So for example, initially, I might have started 20 feet away from the water and just waited until he gave me some sort of sign that he remembered I was there. And Ned is sort of middle of the road when it comes to his independence level. My first toller, Jaden, was one of the most independent dogs that I have ever known. I had to work really hard with him to see value in me rather than value in just being off and playing by himself. And Ned is much more amiable than that, but he's sort of middle of the road. He still has a very independent streak to him. So this training was really the catalyst that turned things around and made him want to work for me. And now I would say he doesn't have that independent streak at all. He's fully realized that all the wonderful things in his life come from me. So he's very quick to look to me for rewards at this point. And that really all started with the water. So simple behaviors, going up to the creek, asking him to sit. And then as soon as his butt was on the ground, rather than giving him a cookie, because in that environment, There was no food that would trump the water. The water was absolutely the bee's knees for him. So as soon as his butt hit the ground, I would mark it and then tell him, okay, go swim. And I'd let him go jump in the creek and play around a little bit. And I'd play with him too from the shoreline, trying to stay dry. And then I had the leash on so I could call him out and reward that if he did well with it. And sometimes my reward for that was actually to say, yes, go swim, and send him right back in again. Because I had the leash on, if he said, no, I can't right now, I'm too busy playing, I could physically make him get out of the water and take that reward away. So controlling that situation was so, so crucial, because on the other situation, if I didn't release him to the water and he went and rewarded himself, that is basically him giving himself permission to ignore me completely and look to the environment and his own desires for all those rewards. So important that you control the situation and you let them know when it's okay and when it's not. Within a matter of about a week or two with Ned, with repetition of that, very simple behaviors and lots of high-end reinforcement for making the right choices, and that reinforcement of going into the water was as high-end as it got for Ned. Within a couple of weeks, I was at the point where I could have him running full tilt to the water. I could call him, have him turn, and get that reward for me instead. So it just in that act of him waiting for me or expecting permission to come from me, that helped me establish the stop of permission as well. It helped me establish the attention around water. It really, really helped him to understand that I was reinforcing in that environment. And that, I think, went such a long way to creating the relationship that we have now, and the working relationship especially that we have now.
I think it's really important, especially for those of you who listen to our podcast that are maybe a little bit more advanced dog trainers. You know, you've done a few extra things with your dog, and you have maybe a little bit deeper understanding of the process of teaching them to do unusual, unique behaviors. But the idea that the reward comes through you really opens the door to a lot of different things with your dog. And I think that's really a sort of a very important sort of nugget of dog training wisdom that we should talk about a little bit more. I think that it's you use this situation where Ned can go in the water and splash around. Well, what if you're struggling to not let himself reward? What are your steps? So if maybe somebody's got a tug toy and the dog just will not leave the tug toy alone. So what are your steps when you talk about using maybe a distraction as a reward as well?
Well, always working at a level where the dog can be successful. So when I started talking there, I said we might have started 20 feet away from the creek initially and then moved closer. So in that example with the tug toy, you can have that tug toy tucked away in your pocket, or you can use it as a reward, or you can use it as a distraction somewhere in the environment so that you're actually challenging your dog to work through that. And again, distance is a big factor with dogs. So if you have one of those situations where initially when you start this training, your dog is so focused on that distraction that they really aren't giving you the time of day, or they're struggling against the leash to get to that distraction and they've forgotten completely that you're there on the end of the leash, move further away from it. Make it easier for them to have success, or maybe make that tug toy a lesser distraction. So you might, for example, put out a tug toy that they like, but they don't really lose their minds over, so that you can work through that. And then you might have the tug toy that they do lose their minds over in your pocket. So when they make the good choice, you walk up to that tug toy that's sitting out that's not that exciting, and they know that it's not an option for them at that point because you've got them on leash and you're not letting them have it. If they make a better decision, whether it's turning around and focusing on you or whether it's responding to one of the commands that you're giving them, you can then mark it and reward it with the thing that they absolutely adore. So whatever that happens to be. I always try to set up the scene so that what I have to offer my dog is more rewarding than what they are having trouble with. And of course, with things like bodies of water, that was impossible. So I used the water itself because there was nothing that I could do to have a different piece of water to reward my dog from. But in the event of things like toys, in the event of food on the floor, That's a big challenge that people have when they're training using food is the dogs will often start to obsess over the floor because you drop crumbs and things like that. So I will actually proactively work through that with my dog where I put food on the ground, and it's usually more boring food to start with. So for example, I would put maybe a couple of Cheerios on the ground or put something in a container where the lid's locked on, but there's holes in the lid so they can smell it. And I am going to make sure that I have steak or, cheese or liver or something in my pocket so that when my dog responds to his name, for example, off of those Cheerios, I have something really, really amazing to reward him with in place of those Cheerios. So he doesn't feel like the distraction's there and he can never, ever get any reward from it. And it's just frustration on the part of the dog. They are such smart creatures and they will figure out very, very quickly if you're consistent and don't allow them to get to that distraction that they need to wait for you to reinforce them with that distraction. They need to wait for you to give permission and let that distraction be an option. And if they do make that good choice where they're ignoring that distraction and leaving it alone, better things come when they focus up on you. So yeah, I can try to steal the Cheerio off the ground, or I can look at you and I can get cheese or steak or something really wonderful, plus a bunch of play thrown in and, all sorts of reinforcing things.
And this is one of the reasons why we think it's so important to manage your puppy the right way. We strongly believe in using a leash when you're doing this training because your dog can make mistakes. You may overestimate your dog's ability to make the right choice, and it can really move you backward if your dog is self-rewarding, if they scoop that food off the floor, if they go jump in the water when they haven't earned it yet, which is one of the huge reasons that we want to use a leash on our dog, so that if they make the wrong choice, we can guide them back. It's really at the foundation of a lot that we believe in that we teach is letting your dog make a choice. Would you agree with that, Shannon?
Absolutely. And we actually did a podcast, Is Management More Important Than Training? And if you are struggling with environmental distractions with your dog, that would be a great one to go and have a listen to. There's a blog post on it as well, because management is such a crucial component of this whole thing. I remember when I was first training Quincy, my Rottweiler, and this was when I first got into dog training, a couple of decades ago now. And I remember several times through her youth thinking, I'll fix that later. I'll fix that later. I don't really know how to fix that now. I'm sure it'll fall into line later. And I ended up in a situation once I started learning. I came to McCann's and I had all sorts of great support and advice. And I started to realize that I had sort of shot myself in the foot a little bit by making things more difficult because I had afforded her the opportunity to self-reward. And I had given her the chance to find things in the environment more interesting than she found me. So I don't think that in and of itself is the most important thing in the world, but I do think it's important that we don't allow the environment to be so reinforcing that we no longer are part of the equation. So having that management in place is really what makes or breaks the ease of your dog training. If you can prevent the dog from realizing all the wonderful things in the environment or thinking all the wonderful things in the environment are more important than you, then you will have a much easier time of maintaining their focus and having them look to you and want to do the right things. And I think that really is the difference between becoming a dog trainer and understanding how to help your dog be successful and making those excuses because you're not quite sure how to solve those issues.
And oftentimes, we hear students say something like, oh, he always listens to me in the house, or he always listens to me in the backyard, but I go to the park and things fall apart. He just won't listen. Taking stock in what we've been talking about today will help you move through the point where your dog doesn't listen anymore. Using that leash, using that line, using those distractions to challenge your training is absolutely crucial if you expect to have a dog who listens, who responds every single time.
Definitely. And I always say, if you have a dog that if you've made that statement, and I remember making that statement with Quincy, like she was doing this all week at home, and then I'd come to class here and she'd be distracted by the other dogs in class, and I'd be thinking, I look like I haven't practiced at all, and we worked really hard this week. And I always think back to that now, and when I'm talking to students, I always say, you know what, if they're listening in the house, That's wonderful. It means that they're a cooperative dog by nature, which is great. They want to work for you. Now you just have to challenge it with the distractions. And that is something that you can systematically approach. I always talk about setting up distractions rather than waiting for them to occur naturally in the environment. Like we just talked about, putting the food out on the floor and working through that with the dog. It's going to give your dog a great opportunity to understand what the exercise is. And then when you get to the point where you're out and about in the real world and there's real world distractions, they've had practice in the house in an environment that's familiar to them, but with that challenge of the distraction being added to the environment. So never underestimate how strong that is going to make your dog training. And I think that's one of the things that I was missing when I first started training Quincy. I think we filled in the gaps pretty quickly when we started the program here at McCann's, but I would expect the same behavior out and about in the real world that I got in the house. And I didn't really understand until I started training here how to sort of bridge that gap and how to fill in the gap between the sterile environment of my house that wasn't novel and wasn't exciting and the exciting environment of class or the park down the street, etc. So we made leaps and bounds in progress when I got to the point where I knew I needed to set up those distractions and teach her through those and basically just continue to incrementally increase the distractions until she was at the point where, I could be dropping food on her head as she was doing an attention exercise and she would still continue watching because she knew those distractions were not an option. Watching me was what got her the great rewards. So it's so important. It can't be overstated enough how important it is to help your dog work through those distractions.
Absolutely. We know that reliable skills are built on a solid foundation of success. So if you feel like you're struggling, then take a step back, make it a little bit easier for your dog to be successful. We are often talking about how being consistent, clear, and fair with your dog is vital to your dog training. Making it a little bit easier for your dog to be right. You would never just drop those treats on her head in your second lesson. You'd make sure that you'd had some success so that she clearly understood the skill. I think that's such an important takeaway for our students who sometimes we get questions and they say, I took my dog to the cottage and he's not responding to name. I don't know what it is. Well, we need to set our dogs up to be successful because we know how situational dogs can be. They have a tough time generalizing some of these things, and some of these distractions are more challenging than others.
Definitely. And I saw that with Ned when we went out and about starting our field training work and when we started getting into other ponds and other bodies of water. And I usually had to get to wherever we were going and set up a little drill so that we could work through that first so that he understood the rules in this water are the same as the rules in the water we've been practicing at. But it would usually be, until he was about 8 or 9 months of age. And then we could get to the point where I could get somewhere and I would have his full listening and his full attention right there and then. And that sounds young. I know 8 or 9 months of age, but that really is the sort of age that you start to feel if you have managed the situation well and not allowed the dog to self-reward in all sorts of different environments. That's the age where you start to really see things coming together as far as that obedience and the dog's understanding and the dog looking to you for information. So never underestimate the difference in the environment. And as you said, dogs being tremendously situational, we need to take that into account when we go to different locations. They're not going to have the same responses early on in their training when you get to the cottage as they would when you were practicing in your backyard at home. So those are all things that have to come into play. And those are just environmental distractions. And you can work through those just as well as you would work through any other distraction.
Tons of really important information about training your dog and using distraction and how important it is for your dog to have a full understanding of their responsibilities when it comes to working through some of these challenges. It's lots of fun to challenge your dog with something new, and I love the fact Shannon's example of sending Ned to water. I just love that as a reward for your dog as well. Now, at the end of our podcast episodes, we've started to ask our community if they have any questions that they'd like us to answer. And today's question comes from Paul Cote. And Paul says, my 6-year-old Chihuahua raises his leg and marks his territory whenever I take him to someone else's house. I keep a very close eye for the first few hours, but he still manages to sneak it in. And Shannon, I know you've written, I believe, a blog post on this topic specifically.
I have. It's a topic near and dear to my heart because I have, except for Quincy, my Rottweiler, I have exclusively had male dogs in my life, and most of them have been intact until there's a reason for them not to be intact, a health reason, or, if they've left me. But this is something that I find to be several different things to contribute to the idea of you are not allowed to lift your leg anywhere but sort of the designated areas. So that means not in the house. That means not on my deck. There's places in the yard that you can certainly lift your leg. I personally do not like my dogs peeing on other people's bushes or shrubs. Some people don't mind, I'm sure, but I find it is inappropriate to let my dog pee on other people's properties. So when we are walking to the park, my dogs are not allowed to stop and lift their leg. And that, again, that is in itself is twofold, because if I allow my dogs to stop while we're doing a let's go and walking, and I'm expecting them to walk in heel position, if I allow them to stop and lift their legs on things, chances are I'm going to be stopping about every 3 or 4 steps with those boys, especially with more than one boy with me on my walk usually. So the rule is, no, you're not allowed to stop when we're doing let's go. When we're on our way and we're walking, I expect you to maintain control position at my left-hand side and keep a loose lead. And you can air scent, but stopping and peeing on everybody's everything is not something that I allow my dogs to do. And then when we get to where we're going, where they can pee, I will then tell them, okay, hurry up. And that's my command, for my cue rather, for them to be able to mark somewhere. If I let them off leash and tell them, okay, you're free dog sort of thing, at that point they can go and they can pee on things wherever they want. They're on their own time. And I know boys love marking. So, they usually have all my boys out, they usually have the line up at whatever tree it is that's being anointed. And the first dog will pee on it and then wander away. And the second dog will pee on it, wander away. And then oftentimes the first dog will come back and re-anoint things. So that's all well and good. So I very clearly established that this is an okay time for you to go to the bathroom, and I'm consistent with that. The rest of the time, I'm very consistent with you are not allowed to mark. And with all of the boys that I've had, I've never once had a dog that has tried to lift their leg in the house. And I don't know if that's just dumb luck or if that's because I've been very consistent with the idea that you can only do this, when you're given permission. And it's not as militant as it sounds. It's just a bit of consistency. And I think that really helps with the idea of not marking inside of buildings, inside of the house, at my friends' houses. I will also teach my dogs to not pee on that. And that's actually the phrase that I use. Just don't pee on that. So if I see them heading towards something that I think, you know what, I don't think that's a good place to pee. Or for example, here around the property, we all walk our dogs off leash here all the time. There's a couple of houses on the property, and I do not want my dogs to pee on the corners of those houses. I think it's inappropriate. So there's a million different places for them to be able to pee on this property, probably 1,020,000. So they can use those as their areas to pee. And I will very clearly teach them a strong leave it command so that they understand when they approach something. And you can always tell when the boys are going to pee, you see that sniffing, you see that sort of sidling up to something. And I will work very hard on leave it, which with my dogs turns into don't pee on that, specifically for the leg lifting thing. And that comes with a lot of rewards for me, but it also comes with me being on my toes and getting that information out very quickly and very early. So chances are I'm never going to have a dog that offers to not pee on something. Once they've set their mind on it, they're probably going to be thinking about peeing on it unless I interrupt it. So again, initially, this is why having your dog on a leash or on a long line is such an important thing, because as soon as you see them start to lift their leg and start to lift their leg potentially on something inappropriate, you have the means of stopping it. So I will either at that point tell my dog quickly with a nice sharp leave it. And if they, initially they probably don't necessarily understand that that applies to lifting their leg as well. So I have that leash or line on so I can back myself up. I can pick up that leash or line and I can remind my dog, leave it, and I can direct them away from whatever it is they they were about to lift their leg on. And then, of course, I will give them the other half of the equation. So I'll bring them over to something they can pee on, and I'll reinforce that. Okay, buddy, go hurry up over here. And that gives them that great information. Not everything is available for you to pee on. Even though your instinct says that's what you want to do, you need to mind your P's and Q's. So that, of course, means that I have to be on my toes.
And mind your P's specifically.
Very good. Very clever. So that in and of itself is probably not going to transfer to the house, but having that cue in place and that command to say, leave it or don't pee on that, which is, for whatever reason, that's what my cue evolves into when we're out and about. Hey, don't you pee on that. And then the boys will look back at me and I'll praise them and I'll say, okay, go hurry up over there. And it's all just information, but it makes it viable for me to watch when they're in new places, and especially when they're young and in new places. It makes it a viable option for me to stop them from that behavior. And I think that that is such an important thing to have with males, whether they're intact or not. And a lot of the times with females too, you do get females that really, really like to mark as well. So it's something that's a really handy thing to have in your back pocket.
I think what's sort of the overarching idea here is that you are aware and you are observing your dogs to give them that information. I know Paul had mentioned that for the first couple hours, the dog's okay, but he still manages to sneak it in. So I would urge Paul to really keep an eye on his dog. If he's not able to supervise them through this, then maybe taking your crate to your friend's house is a good idea, because then your dog can be free for however much time you want to have them out. And then when you get distracted and your dog is likely to make a mistake, then you can pop them in their crate, which they won't they're less likely to have an accident in, and they can't mark your neighbor's or your friend's couch or wall or thing when they're in there.
That is the great management aspect of things. So again, management in training and with your dog is so, so important. So I think, Paul, what we're trying to say here is that it's not going to be one quick thing. There is going to be some training that you need to do outside of that specific situation, and then management inside of that situation to make sure that the dog doesn't make a mistake and doesn't make the wrong choice.
Yeah, really great. Now, if you have questions that you'd like us to answer here on the McCann Dogs podcast, you can always ask us on our Twitter feed at McCann Dogs, or you can leave a comment in one of the any of our social media platforms. You can reach out to us and let us know, because we'd really like to take this opportunity to answer your questions. And I know there are lots of questions out there, but the easiest one is probably on our Twitter feed at McCann Dogs. If this is your first time on our YouTube podcast channel, make sure you hit that subscribe button. We publish new videos every single week to help you understand the why behind how dogs think and learn. And on that note, my name's Ken, and this is Shannon. I want to wish you happy training. Bye for now.